In this lecture, we're going to be covering Chapter 5, Arguments about Causes. It may be surprising to learn, but causality is actually a difficult concept in philosophy, specifically in metaphysics. Since David Hume, we've been trying to define causality in a consistent way, free from circular reasoning. Every attempt has either failed due to circularity, or it admitted of some troubling counterexamples. In his work, A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume discusses the concept of causation and challenges common sense notions of causality. He argues that our understanding of causation is not necessarily based on any inherent connection between supposed cause and effects, but rather on our observations of constant conjunctions between events. Hume argues that we infer causation from repeated experiences of one event consistently preceding another. It seems that Hume is saying causation is not something that exists independently of the external world, but is rather a product of our mental processes. He emphasizes that we can't directly perceive causation itself, but only the regularities and patterns in our experiences. In other words, causation is a concept constructed in our minds to make sense of the world. According to Hume, a cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, where all objects resembling the former are placed in like relationships of precedency to those objects that resemble the latter. In simpler terms, Hume seems to be saying that a cause is something that comes before and is connected to another thing. When we observe objects that are similar to the first object, we see that they also come before and appear connected to objects that are similar to the second object. And that's the whole story. To put it even more simply, Hume is describing how we perceive cause and effect relationships based on our observations of similar events happening in a certain order. He's trying to get across the idea that our understanding of causation is based on our experiences and observations of the world around us, but not based on experience or observation of causation itself. Now, even though the terms are often used synonymously, there are some helpful distinctions that can be made between causation and causality. Causation often refers to the relationship between cause and effect, the idea that one event leads to another. Think of particular instances of cause and effect. It's the concept we use to explain why things happen the way they do. On the other hand, causality is often a broader philosophical concept that encompasses the study of cause and effect relationships and the principles that govern them. Hume's treatment of causation challenges the traditional understanding of causality by suggesting that our knowledge of causation is based on our subjective experiences and observations. He argues that causality is not a fundamental aspect of the external world, but rather a natural product of our mental processes. Causality could be something that our minds impose on the impressions of the world we observe as our brains attempt to make sense of reality. The philosophical problem is that we can't actually see the causality in events that we believe are instances of causation. So, the only reason we conclude that cause and effect relationships exist is because of the repeated observations of changes in spatiotemporal relations between events. These repeated observations create a habit of the mind to expect these changes will occur. This leads to circular reasoning, which we know is fallacious, namely, that the future resembles the past because the future resembles the past. But let's re-articulate Hume's definition and analyze it using examples. Of two events, A and B, we say that A causes B when the two always occur together, that is, are constantly conjoined. Whenever we find A, we also find B, and we have a certainty that this conjunction will continue to happen. When a billiard ball collides with another, we expect the second to move as a result of the collision. When we strike a match, we expect it to ignite, and we always expect these conjunctions of events under normal conditions. So far, so good. Now, let's look at an unusual example. Let's say, for the first time in recorded history, Halley's Comet is seen over Atropia, and the next day a conflict erupts. 75 years later the comet returns, and the next day another conflict erupts in Atropia. Scholars notice this, and some conclude that the comet has some kind of astrological powers that induce conflict in Atropia, and the next time Halley's Comet returns, sure enough, conflict erupts. So, every time these events, Halley's Comet and conflict, occur, they occur together, and people expect the conjunction will continue to happen. So, people begin to believe that the comet causes the conflicts. It fits the definition, but would we really consider this cause and effect? Despite this difficulty with the definition, is it clear what needs to be changed precisely in the definition to make it work? Let's see what happens if we try to re-articulate this definition to compensate for the last example. Of two events A and B, we say that A causes B when the two always occur together, that is, are constantly conjoined, but only in a way that A causes B. Whenever we find A, we also find B, and we have a certainty that this conjunction will continue to happen. Now, does that work? Unfortunately, it doesn't. If you read closely, you'll see that all this definition says is A causes B if A causes B, which is circular, and Hume knew this full well. Hence the difficulty he proposes with our common sense notion of cause and effect. Clearly, the metaphysics of causality are difficult to comprehend, and that depth of metaphysics is more appropriate for a dedicated metaphysics course. For this course, we'll set these metaphysical difficulties aside and rely on our common sense notions of cause and effect as we focus on college-level writing. In this chapter, Weston emphasizes the importance of clearly explaining the causal relationships between events and arguments about causes. He advises us to articulate how the proposed cause logically leads to the observed effect, providing a clear and coherent explanation for the causal connection. By elucidating the mechanism or process through which the cause produces the effect, we can strengthen the cogency and credibility of our arguments. Weston further recommends proposing the most likely cause when making an argument about causes. He explains that showing your explanation to be the most plausible for a given effect increases the cogency and credibility of your argument. By carefully considering the available evidence and reasoning, we can make compelling cases for the causes that seem supported by the available information. Weston cautions us against assuming a causal relationship between correlated events without sufficient evidence to support the claim. This shouldn't be a surprise given the implications of our previous discussion on the metaphysics of causality. He explains that correlation does not imply causation, and that two events may be correlated due to chance or to the influence of a third variable. By recognizing that correlation alone is not sufficient to establish a causal relationship, we can avoid arriving at unwarranted or premature conclusions about causes and effects. Just remember, correlation does not equal causation. Weston points out that correlated events may share a common cause, rather than one causing the other directly. He explains that the observed correlation between two events may be explained by the influence of a third variable that affects both events simultaneously. By considering the possibility of a common cause, we can broaden our understanding of the relationship between events and avoid oversimplifying complex causal relationships. Weston acknowledges that in some cases, two correlated events may influence each other in a reciprocal manner, with either event potentially causing the other. He explains that causation might even be bidirectional in certain situations, where the relationship between cause and effect is mutually reinforcing. He gives the example of concerns that television and video games might be ruining our morals. This was a big concern in the 80s and 90s. However, it could be that our morals are degrading, and the media has to follow suit to keep our interests. This is similar to the recent complaints about Disney. Some people will argue that Disney is trying to change our interests, but it's also possible that Disney is changing to suit our interests. Even though the possibility of bidirectional causation is metaphysically questionable, if we entertain it, we can avoid oversimplifying causal relationships that are complex and consider the dynamic relationship or interplay that is possible between events. Finally, Weston reminds us that causes can be complex and multifaceted, involving multiple factors or variables that interact in intricate ways. He explains that understanding complex causes requires careful analysis and consideration of the various factors involved. By acknowledging the complexity of causation, we can develop more nuanced and sophisticated arguments about causes, taking into account the diverse array of factors that contribute to the observed effects.